We're going to talk about why do we need to use glucose in the first place. Like, what's the point of glucose? Okay, all living organisms on this planet, maybe I should say most, not sure it's quite all, have the ability to convert glucose into our usable form of energy by the cell, which is ATP. And again, we talked about that ATP is what's used to power all of life's processes. So active transport, for example, uses ATP. Movement uses ATP. So why are plants doing this tedious process of taking the ATP to get from the light reaction and storing that energy in glucose? Well, one reason is plants use glucose for growth. It's not just an energy molecule, it can also be a structural molecule. Plants can synthesize these structural molecules like cellulose by linking a bunch of glucose molecules together, and then through hydrogen bonding creates a very rigid, kind of tough, cord-like structure that gives their cell walls strength, giving them their shape and their stability. Plants also store glucose as starches, which are long chains of glucose molecules bonded in a slightly different pattern than cellulose. But those starches can be stored in various parts of the plant and can be used later in case the plant can't photosynthesize one day and needs an energy source, and so it can use its starches. A lot of the foods that we eat, like potatoes and carrots and some other starchy foods, radishes, corn, good example, are all foods that we eat because they contain starch, and that starch gives us energy. The plants would use that starch, though, if we left it to them, to do things like produce flowers, or to produce next year's growth, or to produce fruits, to disperse their seeds. And so starches are used for those reasons. Now, heterotrophs eat autotrophs in some way or another, either directly eating them, like if you eat an apple, you're eating the product of an autotroph, and that's giving you energy. Even if you don't eat fruits and vegetables, which you should, or grains, which you also should, you're just a meat eater, and you just eat meat all the time, the meat that you ate came from an animal that ate an autotroph. So ultimately, we can trace all of our energy back to a plant. And then we use the glucose, and we break it down and make ATP from it. Now, all organic molecules that are consumed by an organism can be broken down. So it's not just starch. We don't just get energy from starch. Then why would we eat meat? Why would we eat other things that have lipids and proteins in them? We can break down proteins and carbohydrates and fats and get energy out of all three types of molecules. So it's not just carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are probably the easiest. We probably get the most bang for our buck for breaking down carbohydrates, but we can use protein. You can use lipids to get energy. They all will feed into the cell respiration process at some point and provide energy to the organism. You can see here. You can see right here that proteins can be broken down to amino acids, and these can enter our respiration process at different levels. Whereas fats can be broken down, and the glycerol and the fatty acid chains can enter at different levels. And so we can break down things other than carbohydrates for energy as well. I'd also like to have you guys notice that these arrows go both directions, which means we can also make proteins. We can make carbohydrates, and we can make fats with food that we consume. Our body has the ability to make some of those things that we need for growth and repair and all the processes that we require. That these are reversible reactions. But there are some things our bodies can't make. There are some essential nutrients that we have to have in our diets because we cannot make them through our metabolism. The two ones that are shown here are amino acids and fatty acids. There are actually 8 essential amino acids that you have to consume to be a healthy adult, which means they need to be found in the food that you eat. Now, if you're a non-vegetarian, if you eat meat, that's usually not a problem. As long as you're getting some protein in your diet daily, like you're eating chicken or fish or beef or pork, that protein has all the amino acids that you would need, and you're fine. Now, are there any vegetarians in here? Any people who choose to not eat meat? Every year I have at least one. Sohan? You're a vegetarian? Okay, you probably have to watch what kind of vegetables you eat, right? You have to make sure, hopefully you're making sure, if not, maybe you should start, making sure you're getting a good variety of vegetables, because some of these plants, like beans, are missing 2 of the essential amino acids. So if you ate just beans your whole life, never touched a different vegetable, you would be missing tryptophan and methionine in your diet, which is an essential amino acid that your body can't make, which means proteins are built of those amino acids. Whereas if you ate only corn, you would be missing isoleucine and lysine. Those would not be found in your diet. And so vegetarians have to be very conscientious of eating a variety of different plant products to ensure they get the fatty acids that they need. Or sorry, in this case, amino acids. I was thinking the next one. Fatty acids. Omega-3s and omega-6s. You guys probably heard of these, right? Okay. We can't produce those. Yeah.
Did you get those in fish?
Yes, you do get them in fish. Fish products, some other, you can get them like, I think soybeans might have them, I might be wrong. There are other products that have fatty acids, these fatty acids in them. They're important for things like brain development, especially at your age right now. Your brain is developing very quickly. It's important that you have these in your diet. In fact, I'm so concerned about this, I buy the really expensive milk for my daughter that has added omega-3 fatty acids in it.
Oh, is that Horizon?
Horizon organic milk. Just adds it to it, just to, make sure that she's getting the fatty acids that she needs for her brain development. Okay, even though it's 5 1/4 for a half gallon of milk, to me it's worth it to make sure she's getting the nutrients that she needs, because we cannot make these in our bodies. And they're essential for our development. I'm not a big fish eater. I don't like fish very much, so I have to get these through supplements and eating other types of foods. Sorry? Oh, well, makes sense. All right, so here's cell respiration. Basically, cell respiration is the breakdown of organic compounds and using that energy from that breakdown to make ATP. It's essentially the reverse of photosynthesis. In fact, if you look at the chemical equation, it looks like the reverse of photosynthesis. We start out with glucose, we use oxygen, break it down into carbon dioxide, water, and the energy is released and harnessed by ATP. Again, this is not actually like a real product. It's just, we're just using the energy of this reaction to recharge the ATP batteries in our cells. So essentially, photosynthesis and cell respiration go hand in hand. They're part of a bigger cycle, if you think about it. Plants, through photosynthesis, give off oxygen and make glucose. All organisms on Earth then eat that glucose eventually, break it down, give off CO2 and water to repeat the cycle. This is probably the most important bullet point on the slide, this last one right here. This is a big misconception people have. Both autotrophs and heterotrophs undergo cell respiration. A lot of times people think that plants don't do this, that they don't use oxygen and break down glucose, that they don't give off carbon dioxide and water. They do, just like we do. So that plant up on the cabinet there needs oxygen just as much as we need oxygen. Even though it's photosynthesizing as well, it still needs oxygen to break down the glucose it's making. For example, if you look at this plant, you can kind of see it from your sitting maybe. The leaves are green, they contain chlorophyll, they're photosynthesizing, they use CO2 and water to make glucose. What about the stem? The stem is brown. You can't see it. Is the stem photosynthesizing? No. Then how is it getting its energy? From the glucose being made in the leaves. Well, how does it get the ATP out of that glucose? Well, it has to go through cell respiration. What about the roots that are underneath the soil? Are they photosynthesizing? No. Where do they get the energy they need?
From the glucose.
From the glucose produced by the leaves, and then they have to break that glucose down to get ATP. So plants undergo cell respiration just as much as we do. So plants need oxygen, plants need glucose in all of their cells. Just because they photosynthesize doesn't mean they use the glucose for anything. When you think of an organic molecule, you know, there's an abundance of hydrogens, and with each hydrogen is an associated electron that has energy to it. And so through respiration, we're basically trying to get that energy out. We're trying to rip off the hydrogens, take those electrons, and use them to make ATP. This high energy electron will eventually be used to make ATP in the cell. Basically what happens is that we transfer the hydrogen to from an organic molecule, we transfer it to oxygen. That releases energy. That energy is used to make ATP. So again, the overall function is to transfer those energy electrons into the phosphate bonds of our ATP molecule, to connect that third and second phosphate together. For every glucose molecule that enters cell respiration in a eukaryote, so an organism that has a nucleus, you generally get 36 ATP molecules produced. That's a rough average. Whereas prokaryotes get about 38. They get a little bit more because they have one less step that we have to do. We can break down more glucose at once, though, so we actually end up getting more energy for our efforts, but we get slightly less per glucose molecule. It's really not that big of a deal, though. Yeah?
Would you count that as a lot of ATP?
2?
Oh, no.
Oh, 36, 38? Not really. I mean, you're not going to survive on one glucose molecule a day. So no, I would not consider that a lot. Now, we can divide respiration into two different types: aerobic, which requires oxygen, and anaerobic, which takes place in the absence of oxygen. Both start with the same process called glycolysis. And glycolysis directly produces some ATP for the cell. After glycolysis, you either go the anaerobic route, which is oftentimes called fermentation, or you go the aerobic route. Now, someone raise their hand, what's the big difference between going anaerobically versus going aerobically, based on this diagram? Kevin?
With aerobic, you can produce more ATP.
Yeah, you get a second ATP producing step in aerobic respiration. So you actually get more ATP produced if you go the oxygen present route. You get a second production of ATP in the process. Whereas fermentation, you just rely on glycolysis to give you your ATP. So we're going to start by talking about glycolysis. It comes out of section 1, and you read about this over the weekend, hopefully. It's the first step of cell respiration. In fact, the word glycolysis itself kind of tells you what happens. You think of the word glyco, what does that mean? We talked about it when we looked at glycolipids, we looked at glycoproteins. What does glyco refer to? Glucose, so we can just say sugar, to be simple. And then the word lyse, we talked about this in our cell transport unit where we talked about cytolysis, where the cytoplasm lysed the cell. What does lyse mean? It's not the creepy crawlies that get in your hair. Yes? Not a process necessarily. Yeah? Okay.
Split apart.
The split, or I'm going to say to break. You can say split, that works too. It's the sugar breaking step. We break apart glucose. That's the first step in the respiration process, is we break glucose apart. It's anaerobic though. What does that mean again? We don't need O2, so no O2 needed. No oxygen needs to be present for that to happen. It takes place in the cytosol. That's the liquid part of your cells. Okay, so your cytoplasm is made up of cytosol and then all the organelles. So the cytosol is kind of the liquids, like the soup of enzymes that are be involved in this reaction. And we need a special molecule. We've met its cousin already. NADP is its cousin. In respiration, it's NAD plus. But since they're cousins, they kind of do the same thing. They carry high energy electrons. This is very important, though, that it is needed for glycolysis to happen. We need NAD+, and we'll talk more about that later. Let's kind of hang on to that thought. So we're going to start with our 6-carbon glucose molecule. I'll draw it kind of the same way we did for the Calvin cycle. Just circles represent carbon. So there's our 6 carbons in glucose. We oxidize it. Who remembers? What does it mean to oxidize? Think of oil rig. Cassidy? What does it mean to oxidize? Think back to oil rig. Oxidation is a loss of what? Nope, not a phosphate group.
It's a loss of electrons.
Loss of electrons. So we basically steal some electrons away from glucose. In doing so, we break it in half, and we get 2 of these 3 carbon molecules we've seen before. We get some P-gals. P-gals eventually converted into a molecule called pyruvic acid, or sometimes pyruvate. And that's the end product of glycolysis, are pyruvates. From this process, we actually need 2 ATP to start it, so we're down 2 ATPs. We're 2 ATPs in the hole. But then we gain 4, so what's our total then? How many have we gained? How many have we gained in total?
2.
Yeah, we get a net gain of 2. That gives us a net profit of 2 ATPs. It's like me giving you $2 and you giving me 4. I gained $2 off the deal. That'd be a pretty bad deal for you. Okay, it's a good deal for the cell though, because the cell gains 2 ATPs by doing this. Think of the negative 2 ATPs. These are kind of like activation energy. Gets the reaction going. We also get a couple of these molecules, NADHs. And these, just like the ATPs, or sorry, NADPH we saw, carry high energy electrons with their associated hydrogens. Very similar to NADPH. So here's the reaction. It's actually a multi-step reaction. We're not going to talk about the steps. We're going to focus in on what goes in, what comes out. So I'm going to put what goes in. I'll put this in whatever color I have, green. So glucose goes in. 2 ATPs go in. NAD plus goes in. Technically ADP goes in a couple steps. But you guys understand that you need ADP to make ATP. Hopefully you learned that from the activity we did. And then what comes out, I'll put that in red. We get NADH. We get 4 ATP. And we get our pyruvates. And these pyruvates still have a lot of stored energy associated with them, because there's a lot of chemical bonds that we can break down further. This is not the last step in respiration. But again, we only get a net gain of 2 ATP, which is not a lot of energy. So there's glycolysis simplified. There's the little more detailed reaction. Did I just hear an "Oh Jesus"? This is heavy stuff, and by no means are we going to have you remember any of these terms, except for glucose and pyruvate. Whatever happens in the middle, to you guys, it's just going to be the magic of biology and chemistry. But here's the cool thing. Two reasons why we show this slide. First reason is, if you look, glycolysis is going from glucose to pyruvate. This is reversible. We can make glucose from pyruvate by a process called gluconeogenesis. What does the word genesis refer to? The creation. Okay, in the book of Genesis in the Bible, there's the creation of the story. Okay, the story of creation is in that book of the Bible, and that's what Genesis means. It's the creation of glucose from pyruvate. So, just like that other diagram we saw with two-sided arrows, this reaction is reversible. Another reason why I show this is because if you take a higher level, like organic chemistry class in college, you'll learn that these names have meaning to them. Like they actually are written this way for a reason. Like 3-phosphoglycerate tells you the phosphate is on the third carbon of the molecule. And so you could definitely see by the names changing that we are changing the side groups, the functional groups around on those intermediate molecules. And so changes are taking place, which is why we need ATP sometimes, and we need NAD for this reaction to happen. Yes?
Just for curiosity, how do you say the one that's under the 3-phosphate?
Under the 3-phosphate. The glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate?
The glyceride thing. The thing under that, where it's like 3 words all together.
This one?
The one under that.
This one?
Up until
Oh, glyceraldehyde phosphate dehydrogenase? That's an enzyme. Everything in blue here is every enzyme that's involved. ACE, see all the ACEs? Those are all enzymes. Fructose 1,6-bisphosphate makes fructose 1,6-biphosphate. So the enzyme that ends in the ACE takes this and turns it back into fructose 6-phosphate. You sound really scientific if you just rattle off these words like they're nothing. But yeah. Don't ask me to pronounce another one because they're really hard. Okay.
Just out of curiosity, why would I need to know this?
If you are a biochemist,
What if I'm not a bio?
then you don't need to know it. That's why we're not teaching it to you. All right, this would be a good overview video of what happens in glycolysis. Fermentation, no ATP is produced. All we do in fermentation is we regenerate the NAD+. I told you this was going to be important. The NAD+ that's needed for glycolysis gets remade, or recycled, I should say, back in the fermentation steps. 2 types of fermentation: alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. They're named after the product they produce. Alcoholic produces alcohol, lactic acid produces lactic acid. Yes, Lindsay?
Lactic acid, is that why you have to keep walking around after you run, otherwise it builds up and makes your leg hurt?
Yes.
Or whatever?
There's a lot of misconceptions about lactic acid. Some people think it makes your legs burn, your muscles burn, or makes them hurt while you're exercising. No, that's just the fact of exercising. That's just what happens. But lactic acid builds up in your muscles and does reduce their performance. So they get fatigued because of it. And they can cause, the next day, if you don't get that lactic acid flushed out, it can cause, muscle soreness. Which is why your coach probably has you do what's called, we call it for cross country, a cool down. Right, Jace? You guys do cool down. That's to kind of get the lactic acid out of your muscles so you don't get that fatigue and soreness. you ever seen like a video of like a marathon runner, and then he's trying to finish the race and his legs just like give out, and like they just collapse, and he tries to get up and he collapses again, and they just can't walk?
We should watch them right.
That's what's called extreme oxygen debt, where their muscles are so, we call it swimming in lactic acid in the runner's world. You're swimming in lactic acid and your muscles just can't function normally anymore because there's so much lactic acid buildup. It's basically your body saying, hey, dummy, stop running. You're not giving me enough oxygen to use. And so it basically forces you to stop, and you continue to breathe, obviously, and return to normal, return to homeostasis. Yes, Neil?
I know that after running a marathon, you're supposed to have like an ice bath.
The ice bath helps increase or decrease muscle inflammation, so swelling. And then when you get out of the ice bath, the difference in temperature encourages more blood flow to help get that lactic acid out. Because lactic acid goes back to your liver and gets converted back into, I think, glucose, eventually back to glycogen. So your body will use it eventually. Yeah, ice baths, though cold and uncomfortable at the time, are really good for recovering after those kinds of things. So we're going to start talking about alcoholic fermentation first. Excuse me. Bakers use this. They actually use yeast to make breads. Has anybody in here ever make bread before? When you go to bake bread, do you like mix all your ingredients and put it right in the oven? No, what do? You gotta wait for it to rise. Okay, what's happening is the yeast cells, the living yeast cells, are eating all the sugars in the bread and then fermenting them. They're producing alcohol, which evaporates, so don't think you can go make bread and get alcohol from it. It evaporates. But more importantly, the carbon dioxide. That's what causes the bread to rise. When you then bake it, all the alcohol evaporates, the yeast is killed off, but the air bubbles are still trapped in there, and that's why you see those holes in bread and why bread's nice and fluffy. Unless you make unleavened bread, which then, what don't you add? You don't add the yeast. Okay, which tends to be a sweeter bread because there's more sugars in it, because the yeast haven't eaten the sugars up. It's also used to make wine and beer and ethanol, which can be added to gasoline. In fact, one of the potential solutions to our energy problems of relying on oil, if we could start using cars that run on pure ethanol, we could just ferment all the energy we would need. Just grow corn, ferment it, get the ethanol, put it in our car, and never have to drill for oil again. What's stopping that?
Oil companies?
Well, some people say the oil companies. Our infrastructure, we have oil pipelines, oil refineries, oil trucks. We'd have to completely change our infrastructure. That's money. And the kind of car we use isn't good enough to be run on ethanol. So if we can design an engine that's just as efficient and powers the same kind of cars that people want, so you can get a Hummer running on ethanol, you could solve that problem. That could be your contribution to society, Jace. Neil? Not if we can get bacteria to do it for us. Genetically modify a bacteria to do it,
It's the American way of thinking.
we can get it to do for us. But yes, you're right. It does take lots of energy to get this process to happen right now. Again, it would take a lot of research, a lot more money involved, a lot of changing the way we live to switch to this route. Here's just a picture of it. Now, I'm not going to test you on, I'm not going to say, what is this to you and make you label it alcoholic fermentation. But here's the pyruvate. What I want to point out, though, are the carbons. So here we have 1, 2, 3. There's the 3 carbons. Here's why it's called pyruvic acid, because what functional group is this? Think that there's an H there.
H2O.
No, that's water.
OH.
It's a carboxylic acid group. Okay? Basically, during this step of alcoholic fermentation, we rip off that carboxylic acid group. It leaves as carbon dioxide. We have now 2 carbons left. It's an aldehyde. That gets eventually produced, converted into ethanol, which is an alcohol. by using NADH to make NAD+, this goes back to glycolysis to keep that reaction going. This is a waste product. You know, if you think about it, alcohol is a waste product of yeast and bacteria. So when people make beer and wine, eventually yeast die because they're swimming in their own waste, basically. Kind of a gross thing to think about, and then you consume that. And
You don't care because you're drunk.
I would say I would never do bread again, but we all know that's a lot.
well, the bread, the alcohol evaporates, so don't have to worry about it. Lactic acid fermentation. Very much similar, except we don't get that production of CO2. And that's really good, because that would be bad if we started producing carbon dioxide bubbles in our body. That would not be good for your health. Okay, we still only get 2 ATPs from glycolysis per glucose molecule, so it's not very efficient. But we've also learned that there are bacteria and there's fungi that use this for their daily lives. We've harnessed their power to make things like cheese and yogurt out of dairy products. I'm not sure if this is 100% accurate, but I've heard that the tartness to yogurt and cheese comes from the lactic acid. I can't confirm that's true or not, but that's what I've heard. Your muscles also produce lactic acid with no oxygen present, or oxygen is scarce, as an alternative to basically dying. Because if they didn't have any energy produced by them, they would die. Your muscle cells would die every time you try to run. So instead, you go to lactic acid fermentation. It allows you to run for a period of time until that builds up and says, okay, stop, you got to start breathing normally again and get me more oxygen. Hopefully by that time you escaped the saber-toothed tiger that was chasing you if you were a prehistoric caveman, running away. Okay, it's an evolutionary mechanism we have that allows us to overcome the problem of having a lack of oxygen in our muscles, because our blood can only supply so much, so fast. Sometimes we try to push the limits to that, and our bodies do respond and help us out. So the soreness in muscles is caused by the buildup of lactic acid, not during the exercise. That's just the fact you're using your muscles. And you get these little microscopic tears in your muscles that cause your muscles to grow and get bigger. It's the soreness after, like the day or so after. Basically because, again, you are breaking down glucose at a faster pace than you're supplying oxygen, so it switches over to anaerobic. That lactic acid diffuses into your bloodstream, goes back to your liver, converted back to pyruvate, which can then be made back into glucose, so you're not like wasting that energy that you've eaten. I really like this picture, though. This is where we're going to end today with this one diagram, because it shows you the importance of this NAD plus NADH cycle. That glucose is broken down to pyruvate. There you get your energy. There's our energy output. Only 2 ATP, but that's okay, enough to keep us alive, at least our muscles for a little bit. That pyruvate then gets converted to lactate, so we get that NAD plus back, so we can keep this cycle going and keep the glucose being broken down, supplying our muscles with 2 ATPs to keep them alive. If this were to shut down, we would shut this down, which means we would shut this down, which means we get none of this, and our cells die. Because they have no ATP to use. So even though lactic acid is not efficient, it is a way our cells can survive with low oxygen. So here's just an overview of the processes that we just talked about. Okay, these are nice diagrams to study off of. Again, showing the cycle again of NAD plus being returned. Both lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation do return the NAD plus to glycolysis. Big difference is you get no CO2 produced here, where you get a carbon dioxide produced here. This is why this is good for making bread. This is not good for making bread. There's a little more complicated version of it, but if you kind of follow it along, it does make sense how glycolysis leads to the production of pyruvate. Pyruvate leads to production of lactate or ethanol to keep glycolysis happening. This all happens outside of the mitochondria, outside in the cytoplasm of the cell, in the cytosol. Because there's no O2, we can't do the next step that we'll talk about tomorrow. All right, so that's where we're going to stop.